Chapter 9, The Riot. Salinas Valley State Prison was the first prison to open after California passed its famous three strikes law. As a result of the new law, the place was instantly filled to double capacity with career criminals sentenced to life with no possibility of parole. They were all angry, hopeless men. The place turned into chaos within weeks. Assault records were broken in months, and 7 wardens arrived and departed in 2 years. The whole flawed strategy of California's and America's 30-year war on crime had come to a head at Salinas Valley. Passing even harsher laws had swept millions of lawbreakers off the streets and into overcrowded, underfunded prisons where gangs controlled the yards and imposed gang rules. All pretenses of rehabilitation were abandoned in the 1990s, not just in California but nationwide, turning prisons into crime schools that sent their embittered alumni back to helpless neighborhoods. Salinas Valley State Prison opened in May 1996 at a cost of $236 million, with an annual budget of $177 million, covered more than 300 acres. It was the 6th maximum security prison built in California since Corcoran set the mold just 8 years earlier. I helped activate 3 of these maximum prisons. I was now a skilled veteran in a vital industry. When I arrived at Salinas Valley, it was the same routine as when I started my first day at Corcoran State Prison almost 8 years ago in 1988. I entered the orientation room and pointed out the fish cops, their uniforms highly pressed and their boots shined. As for me, I walked in wearing my Class A uniform with yellow hash marks indicating my years of service with the CDC. There were only a handful of seasoned veterans that transferred to Salinas Valley State Prison. During orientation, I met Captain Robert Padilla, who was with the parole division and took a liking to me very quickly. After hearing of my professional background, he asked me to join his ISU squad. This would be my 3rd stint in an investigative services unit. I dug the yard and swept the cells with other veteran officers, preparing the prison for the new convicts. At the same time, Captain Padilla had asked me to start up the investigative services unit and ordered all the equipment it needed to function. In June of 1996, the first inmates arrived at Salinas Valley State Prison. The big green and black buses were lined up outside the perimeter fence, filled with inmates ready to be processed into the prison. Not to my surprise, a problem had already risen on the first day. There were 2 inmates in the holding cages that were refusing to come off the bus because they did not request to be transferred to Salinas Valley. They added that they would put up a fight if they had to. The other inmates trickled off the bus one at a time, wearing their orange jumpsuits with leg shackles around their ankles and waist chains with both hands cuffed to their sides. Investigative Sergeant Rocha turned to me and said, "Come on with me, Vodka." We approached the first cage, where a skinny black inmate was refusing to exit the bus. I suppose after taking note of my size, he immediately surrendered, allowing me to remove him from the bus. The second was an obese, sweaty white inmate. He stunk terribly, as if he had not bathed in a month. I hated the idea of having to get physical with him, but before I even got to him, he surrendered as well. I remember the buses were dropping off inmates daily until the prison was at its full capacity, which only took about 3 months. The total population grew to about 4,000 inmates to about 600 officers. There were 4 yards lettered A, B, C, and D. Each yard was able to house 1,000 inmates. A majority of the inmates were in prison for life, and unfortunately, we did not get the programmable inmates. We received the shit inmates, who were the problem children at other institutions, exiled by the warden. Basically, we were the dumping grounds for the worst of the worst, the most violent and unbearable inmates. In the first year alone, Salinas Valley State Prison had the most incident reports in the state of California. All incidents were considered felonies and reported to the local district attorney for possible prosecution. The inmate can be found guilty or not guilty and receive more time on their current sentence. Salinas Valley State Prison had so many violent episodes, the media took notice, airing several segments about the prison. The B yard soon became so brutal that the guards started calling it Little Beirut. It's guilty of child molestation were a high target for other inmates. Many were beaten beyond recognition, stabbed, and had their heads bashed in. Many were beaten beyond recognition, stabbed, had their heads bashed in, bones broken, left to bleed to death on B Yard. One child molester was so terrified of the other inmates, he dove headfirst from his upper bunk into his cell's steel toilet, breaking his neck and leaving brain fragments inside the cell. That motherfucker did a swan dive. As the lead ISU officer, to say my hands were full was an understatement. The daily violence I had to endure and the brutality I was in charge of investigating left me miserable. The constant stress was a poison to my spirit and my marriage. In a last-ditch effort to save my sanity and my marriage, I asked to be released from ISU. I demoted myself and took a job as an ordinary line guard with regular hours and limited responsibilities. The damage, however, was already past repair. On Halloween night, after an exhausting day at work, I was happy to spend time with my son Dalton, who is now 3 and dressed like a pumpkin. Later that night, after tucking him into bed, Diane dropped the bomb on me. DJ, I don't love you anymore, and I'm asking for a peaceful divorce. You can keep the house. I'll be moving out with Dalton. You can have visiting rights anytime. On Thanksgiving Day 1998, as a result of being denied of his request to enter the building to utilize the telephone, an inmate by the name of Hernandez began to kick the building's back door. Officers Chargalov and Serta approached Hernandez in an attempt to reprimand him, at which point he became highly agitated, boisterous, and hostile towards them. He was ordered to submit to a closed body search, but Hernandez only became increasingly rowdy to deliberately gain the attention of the surrounding inmates. As a result of his defiance, Hernandez was placed in handcuffs and prepared to be escorted to the sergeant's office. Suddenly, all of the Hispanic inmates on the yard stopped. Together, they emptied from the basketball court, left the basketball court and pool bar area, all proceeding quickly towards Building 7, where Hernandez was being held. Officers Peterson, Ruiz, Reese, and Officer Castriona took notice and tried to interrupt the approaching Hispanic inmates. Their efforts went ignored. Officer Reese immediately contacted the gun tower and instructed him to put the yard down. The firm command came loudly through the yard speakers. Again, orders were ignored by the Hispanic inmates. All the other inmates obeyed and were lying face down. The Hispanic gang was now blatantly refusing all orders. And Brandon then attempted to defuse and de-escalate the situation by instructing one Hispanic spokesman, the shot caller, to step forward and the remaining inmates to step back and assume the prone position. Inmate Flores approached Sergeant Brandon. The other Hispanic inmates refused to take the prone position and remained standing. Correctional Lieutenant G. Lewis ordered the tower to fire one warning shot into the grass beside the inmates. A final order was given for all inmates to assume the prone position. Hispanic inmates towards the back of the group began to prone out, while approximately 13 others remained standing. Then, through the tense silence, 2 inmates yelled, "Let's get them, it's on." Like a stampede, the inmates rushed towards the staff and began to unleash their fury. At some point during the attack, Officer Chargalov lost possession of his PR-24 side-handle baton. Inmate Holloway gained control of the baton and struck Officer Navarez to the right side of the head, knocking him to the ground. Inmate Mania stood up and began yelling for all inmates to get up and attack staff. As officers attempted to handcuff inmates, they were being attacked from behind. A large group of inmates got up from the prone position and began to run towards the staff when Officer Morris fired his federal 37mm launcher from his control booth position. The wooden baton rounds blasted into the inmates as they attacked. They immediately dropped to the ground. Additional responding staff began to arrive from other yards of the prison and physically began forcing all inmates into the prone position and restraining them on the ground. Temporary flex cuffs were retrieved from the program office and applied to the hands and feet of each inmate to prevent further attacks. There must have been 50 officers, myself included, who responded. The attack injured 18 officers. 14 were transported to Salinas Valley Memorial Hospital. Once the situation was under control, Lieutenant Lewis asked me if I would retrieve the crime camera kit from Complex Control and initiate the collection of evidence and photographs. I heard sirens coming into the prison. There were several outside ambulance agencies taking staff to the hospital for further medical evaluation, and I knew eventually I would have to respond to the hospital and photograph injuries there as well. There were several Hispanic inmates restrained on the yard. I photographed them at point of discovery. Then they were rolled over on their backs, where several of them revealed they were lying on top of an inmate manufactured stabbing weapons meant to be used on the staff. Those were also photographed at point of discovery and then placed into an evidence bag. As the inmates were being brought in from the yard, I noticed many of them had abrasions to their face, neck, and body. I began taking photographs of them to document their injuries as well. By the looks I was getting from my fellow guards, they seemed to be confused as to why I was doing this, documenting inmate injuries. I was doing my job, what I had been asked to do by my lieutenant. "What the fuck are you doing, Vodka?" Officer Faulkner asked. Officer Ivanch peered at me, waiting for my answer. I was confused but responded, "Just doing my job." On November 26, 1998, the riot that broke out at Salinas Valley State Prison made headlines nationwide. To this day, it is remembered by the staff still working at the prison by wearing turkey pins on their uniforms. This is also the day that the trust between me and other officers will be broken. Specifically, I was the one not to be trusted by any staff. This was the day of the forming of the Green Wall. The group went underground for almost 3 years, with the group starting small. It then grew very rapidly and resurfaced in the year 2001 when we received our new warden.